At this anti-globalization protest, they carry an effigy of the greedy industrialist with blood on his hands. American businesses are sharks that prey on the world.
Where the heat is 1800 degrees Celsius and small children are carrying the molten glass.
Well-intended people are upset when they travel to poor countries and see sweatshops where even children work.
Look at this small boy.
Free trade, they say, causes this kind of suffering.
We think more free trade and more sort of opening up of markets for big U.S. corporations is actually hurting working people all over the world and in this country.
First, I want to introduce June Arunga, an entrepreneur from Africa, and also Johan Norberg, author of In Defense of Global Capitalism. He joins us from Stockholm. Johan, let's start with you. The protesters say free trade exploits poor people.
Yeah. And I would say that if trade is exploitation, then the problem in the world is that most people aren't sufficiently exploited. Because when I've traveled around the world and I've looked at industries, sweatshops in Vietnam, in China and other places and talked to the workers there, well, their most consistent and persistent criticism that they put forth to the management is that, why don't you expand more so that my relatives can get jobs like this?
Because maybe the Nike factory only pays $2 an hour, but the alternative employment was 50 cents an hour? Is that a fair comparison?
Well, the thing is that we constantly compare these jobs and these sweatshops to the kind of jobs that we have after 200 years of industrial development. And of course, we don't want jobs like that. But they make the comparison with the kind of domestic industries and the works in subsistence agriculture that they would have otherwise and that their relatives still have. And in that case, we can see that the sweatshops, they are the stepping stones out of poverty. We had sweatshops like this in Sweden and in the US as well before we had this opportunity to export ourselves out of poverty.
All right, but that was then. Now is now. Today, I see pictures of children working in horrible conditions. And doesn't free trade contribute to that? It perpetuates it.
These children have always worked in horrible circumstances, but you haven't seen it before. I mean, trade and globalization makes us suddenly aware of the problems that have always existed around the world. And yes, children work in poor countries, not because their parents are evil, not because the corporations are evil or anything like that. They do it because they are poor and they need the work of their children to survive. What globalization does is that when they give their parents jobs in a supplier to Nike or another Western factory, they get a higher wage and then they can also afford to take their kids out of work and give them an education. Well, in the last 10 years or so that we've seen some sort of globalization and sweatshops in Vietnam, we've seen a reduction in child labor by 2.2 million children. 2.2 million children.
We have a picture of you in Vietnam, I believe, and it shows you and a male manager standing over a group of women who are masked. You guys, frankly, look like the oppressors.
Management tend to be male, and they tend to be the kind of style that we've always seen. The new thing with that picture is that we have women there working outside of their own homes. They get an income of their own. And that's the most important thing, not the wages. When I talk to the female workers there, what they're most happy about is not the wage as such. They're happy that it's higher than in agriculture. The thing is that they become independent. Suddenly they have an income of their own, and it means that they are also free to, well, choose of the kind of lives that they want to lead. If they happen to have an abusive man, for example, they couldn't walk away if they were completely dependent on his income. Now, with industrialization, with globalization, with export jobs like this, they are suddenly free to do that.
June Arunga, you grew up in Kenya. Kenya is known for having trade barriers to protect you, I guess. And the trade barriers include high tariffs on imports, import quotas, restrictions on foreign investment. How's that working out?
We've come a long way in Kenya. There was a time when, in the 70s, you actually had to get written permission from the managing director of General Motors in Kenya to import a car that wasn't a GM car. And thankfully, that has changed. Today in Kenya, you can import second-hand cars from Japan. Most poor people can only afford second-hand cars. If it wasn't for the Japanese having all these second-hand cars, and the people in Dubai having a free trade port, the fad in the 90s of the average middle-class person leaving their civil service job to go to Dubai to bring in these cars and sell wouldn't have happened. Most Kenyans had very, very expensive transportation costs. It was expensive for food and everything. So Kenya has come a long way. We've liberalized a lot of things, and we're all the better for it.
How are you the better for it?
10 years ago, there were only 300,000 telephone lines in Kenya. Today, over 10 million people use cell phones in Kenya in 10 years. I tell you, it's like the discovery of the wheel, opening up trade.
The cell phones were trade. They weren't made in Kenya.
No.
And how did that change people's lives?
They were not made in Kenya, and they were only affordable to Kenyans because the Chinese were making them very cheaply. So by making things where it's most efficient to produce them, poorer people are actually the ones who benefit most. The taxi drivers who can now get calls all the time instead of being physically present when somebody needs to hire a taxi. The plumber who can now get jobs rolling in all the time despite his location. And the hairdresser who can now, with a cell phone, a poor hairdresser can set up their own job, go to people's houses to do hairdressing instead of being oppressed by some madame who's the only one who can afford to have a premises for her to work at. So poor people are actually the ones who benefit the most from increased trade.